Welcome to today's webinar, Best of the Symposium, Emergency Preparedness. During today's presentation, attendees will be in a listen-only mode. There will be no live Q&A session today. However, you may still submit a question. Please use the chat pod located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Type your question in the box at the bottom and click Send. If you have any technical difficulties, you may contact the help desk at 877-297-2901. Now I'll turn you over to Joy Inoue. Joy, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Joy Inoue, and I'm from the Campbell Institute. And today, this webinar, we have for you another one of our Best of the Symposium series. And in this webinar series, we take video that we have from one of our previous symposia, and we replay it because we think that this information is really great, and it would be really helpful to your organizations, and we just can't wait to get that information out to you all. So for this presentation, we have the emergency preparedness, and in this panel discussion, we brought together a cross-section of stakeholders to really answer the question, what can industry, government, and insurers do together to protect people and communities from the next disaster? So we hope that the two people that you will hear from in this presentation, they're going to give you some new approaches and new thinking for your organization when it comes to emergency preparedness. Now let me tell you a little bit about who you'll see in this video. So first up, speaking in the video, is Steve Bowen. Steve Bowen is a director and meteorologist for Aon Benfield's Impact Forecasting Division in Chicago. He leads the firm's Catastrophe Insight Group in conducting real-time and historical global natural disaster analysis. He's collaborated with NOAA, federal, state, and local agencies, insurance industry groups, and universities regarding various weather, climate, and catastrophe loss topics. He was additionally selected to participate on a steering committee for a White House initiative between the public and private sectors that sought to mitigate future impacts from weather events and climate pattern shifts. Steve earned his Master of Science in Business Analytics from the University of Notre Dame and his Bachelor of Science degree in Meteorology from Florida State University. He is a member of the American Meteorological Society and the National Weather Association. The second speaker you'll hear from is Dev Jani. And while no longer in this position, Dev Jani was the Deputy Director and Chief Planning and Preparedness at the City of New Orleans Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. He was responsible for managing 4 areas within the city's Homeland Security enterprise: planning and strategic programs, training, exercises, and evaluation, community engagement, and finance. Prior to joining the City of New Orleans, Dr. Jani held a variety of positions which spanned the fire, emergency medical services, and collegiate emergency response sectors. He received a BS in biochemistry from Stony Brook University and both an MPH and PhD in environmental health sciences from Tulane University, School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Dr. Jani's research and professional focus areas include all hazards preparedness and response, particularly of CBRN incidents, and the translation of this area into policy. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our friends at Beacon Live to get this video started, and I hope you enjoy this encore presentation of the Best of the Symposium Emergency Preparedness, originally filmed in New Orleans back this past February. Thanks, everyone.
So the ironies of a meteorologist with a broken foot at a safety convention is sort of interesting. So today I thought I would sort of set the table for the rest of the discussions with my fellow panelists talking about weather and climate on a global scale, and also talk about how the business community and how all of that is tied, and coming from the insurance industry, how the insurance industry is starting to look at the topic of climate change with more prevalence, and one of the tools that the industry is starting to use more frequently in trying to come up with a better understanding of how to move forward and handle the topic of climate change and some of these large weather events that we continue to see. So let's just get right into it. So we know that weather catastrophe losses are increasing, and there's a lot of people that are on either sides of the equation in terms of the whole topic of climate change and what's driving the losses. For me, I certainly believe that climate change is there. The data certainly shows that that is true. But you can't, in my opinion, have this conversation without also talking about some of the socioeconomic factors and some of the population migration patterns, which all tied together is leading to higher losses as we continue to move forward, simply because there's just more people in more highly vulnerable locations. In terms of the business sector, we know that the global economy is becoming more connected by the day, meaning that you may not directly be impacted by an event physically, but if you have a company that you rely on halfway around the world that was impacted, that supply chain impact, you could see business interruption losses just as significant as if you would have taken a direct hit. So we'll get into that a little bit, and then we'll talk about, from the insurance industry, one of the tools, something called CAT modeling, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So, weather versus climate. I give a lot of talks, talk to a lot of different people, and I realize that there's still a lot of misinformation in terms of not understanding the difference between weather and climate. And I've heard a lot of different explanations to try to explain the two. I've heard weather is your mood, climate is your personality, which is a pretty good one. But I came across this quote from Mark Twain, which I think is really simplistic and sort of perfectly explains the difference between the two. So climate is what we expect, and weather is what we get. And the weather is like outside today. It's beautiful, it's sunny, even though there's thunderstorms coming later tonight, just FYI. And climate is the average. So when your local weather forecaster says it was 65 degrees today, we were 2 degrees from the average, that's climate. That's something, the weather trends over a longer period of time. So that's a pretty big difference between the two. So I was told that this is a very sophisticated audience, and you guys are pretty well versed on the science, so I'm not going to get too deep in it, but I thought I would just talk about some of the climate factors that we've seen just from some of the data. So 2016 last year was the hottest year on record for the third consecutive year. It was exponentially higher than 2015, which was way above 2014. So we've continued to see expedited warmth on a global scale, and that's for sea surface temperatures at the land and in the ocean. This past January was the 386th consecutive month with above normal temperatures. The last time we had a below normal month was December of 1984. So I was born in 1982. So almost the entire portion of my life, I have never seen a month that has not been above average when you're using an anomaly of 1900 to 2000 as your base. And then in terms of global carbon dioxide concentration levels, we had a peak of 409 parts per million last April, and that's significant considering that 400 parts per million was always the threshold in which people were very concerned about that truly causing an increase and spike in some of the extremes of weather events. And you can see with some of the maps here showing the ice core data going back hundreds of thousands of years, where we were just from 1950, just above 300 parts per million, and where we are currently, which is steadily above 400 parts per million. So we are certainly seeing, without any question, that CO2 levels are continuing to increase. And we know that there is a correlation between the two. Using ice core data, geologists can go way back in time. This graphic here goes back 800,000 years, and you can see there's a direct correlation when carbon dioxide levels go up, temperatures go up, and when it's gone down, in the instance of ice ages, you can see the temperatures have also come down as well. This graphic is a little bit old, and if you added the last 2 years to the red line, that's actually going to be showing a greater spike as well. So we're starting to see the CO2 spike catch up to or the temperature spike is starting to catch up to the CO2 spike as well. And so this is just it's a cool graphic that I pulled offline. This shows monthly temperature averages dating to 1850 until today. And you can see that there's a fairly low concentration. Things weren't really big early on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but then in the last couple of decades, we have seen explosive warmth to where we are this year. And you can see we almost hit 1.5 degrees centigrade above normal, which is very, very warm. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when we're talking about on a global scale and heating the oceans, that is a lot of energy that's going into the oceans and allowing a lot more opportunity for evaporation into the atmosphere and more available moisture for very large storms to occur. And getting into that a little bit further, in terms of sea level rise, especially since 1993, we've seen a doubling in the rate of sea level rise at nearly 3.5 millimeters per year. And Deb will go into this a little bit later, but that's pretty significant because over time, that continues to rise. And take Hurricane Sandy, for instance, in 2012 in New York. They have seen within the last 100 years or so nearly 6 to 12 inches of sea level rise. And so you talk about a storm surge going up to where there's a protective storm barrier, that's an additional 6 to 12 inches that overtopped and then went in and flooded the entire metropolitan or the MTA transit system. So it may not seem like a lot, but that's all added up, and you need every inch to protect a lot of coastal communities. And we continue to see large ice glaciers continue to break off in the Arctic and Antarctic, and that's only going to become more of a risk going forward. Now, I would say the most important stat on this slide, and I mentioned this briefly previously, is that 93% of global warming actually ends up being stored in the oceans. Now, why is that important? The biggest and costliest events in terms of weather are tropical cyclones. And if you have more heat and you have deeper depths of the ocean that are warmer, even when there's upwelling, it means that storms are going to be able to maintain and regenerate much more quickly and stay intense as they continue to develop. Even though data is not great going back 100 years or so, but it's worth noting that every major basin around the world for tropical cyclones has set intensity records within the last 18 months. So that is certainly pretty significant and something that concerns us within the meteorology field and also within the insurance industry in trying to identify what to do as these storms continue to increase and in intensity. Now that's a totally different discussion from frequency because the science is still out. I think that's another thing that scientists don't do themselves any favor, is that it's okay to say there are some things that we don't know. And a lot of the talk about frequency is still unknown. We know that the storms, when they are occurring, are more intense. But we don't know yet how, going forward, if the number of intense storms is going to continue a precipitous increase in the future. Okay, so again, let's get into the socioeconomic factors, because again, this is also very important when we're talking about catastrophe losses. So the population continues to grow. We're now at nearly 7.5 billion people. And population migration shifts. So let's consider this. So right now, 44% of the world population lives within 100 kilometers of an ocean coastline. Now, by the next census, the UN estimates that's going to be at or above 50% in 2020. So considering that there are more people and more people moving to highly vulnerable locations, when we get these big events happening, of course they're going to be costlier. So if they're more intense, it's going to be even more catastrophic. So we have to put that into account. Plus the fact that things just are costing more just with nominal GDP growth. Urbanization trends, we'll continue on that theme. So in 1970, you can see that there were a few areas, New York and then in Japan, where there was highly densely urban areas. But you fast forward that to 2014, and you can see that there's been explosive growth almost entirely along the coastlines, not just in the US, but Latin America, Africa, Europe, and particularly in Asia. And you can see the stat by 2050 that we're expecting 2/3 of the population to be living in urban locations. Again, just talking about increased densities of population, so when these events do occur, it's going to be costly and it's going to be devastating. So let's focus in on the US. I'll just go right to the bullet at the bottom there, because that's a pretty amazing stat. So since 1980, 72% of the total population increase has occurred in ocean bordering states. That is pretty significant. You can see that the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast in particular are driving the majority of the population increase, and those states, as we all know, are the most vulnerable to tropical cyclone landfalls. Now, we've been very, very lucky in the sense that we haven't had a major hurricane landfall since Wilma in 2005, major meaning Category 3 or above. But we talk about a Sandy, we talk about Ike, we talk about Matthew from this past year, and we saw the losses. Matthew had a loss of $10 billion in the U.S. alone, and we're going to see more of that. And that was only technically a Category 1 when it made its official landfall in South Carolina. So there's a lot more people and there's a lot more costly exposure that's along the coastline, and it's going to need to be addressed further. And I'll use this example. So this is Miami Beach in 1926. That's what it looked like, the same spot in 2006. So, and I guarantee it's been built up even more than that. So that just shows that if Miami Beach is going to take, say, another Andrew, it's going to be very costly. So let's get more into the numbers. I will apologize in advance. I'm a meteorologist, but my master's is in business analytics, so I love data and numbers, so I'm going to throw a lot at you here. So global weather-related economic losses have increased about 4.1% above the rate of inflation since 1980. What's most interesting, I would say, is looking at the decadal losses. I thought it would be really interesting for all of you to really get a good sense is the fact that these events are becoming much costlier. So in the 1980s, it was less than $50 billion. Thus far, since 2010, we're averaging $173 billion a year of catastrophe loss. That is very significant. From an insurance perspective, insurers have paid out about $1.1 trillion in weather-related loss claims. Now, that sounds like a lot, but on a global scale, about 20%, that equals 20% of the overall cost, meaning that the overall economic loss is about $5 trillion or so during that time. So there was a lot of work to be done, especially in overseas markets, to bridge that divide in terms of a protection gap. And these are individual peril trends. I know there was a few people that were curious about how certain perils were treating. Severe convective storm is a fancy way of saying severe thunderstorm, so that includes tornado, hail, and damaging straight line wind. Tropical cyclone has seen the greatest increase, annual increase, about 6.1%. SCS about 5%, and overall it's about 4.1%. There is no peril that has shown a decrease or has stayed flat. So the trend is definitely pointing upwards. And then just to hone in more on that global discussion again. So you can see in the U.S. Leads in terms of global weather loss at 1.6 trillion, equaling 41%. Asia Pacific is second, about 1.3 trillion. But look at the percentage for the insured loss. The U.S. does a very good job in terms of covering the cost, but we're not all the way there yet. So I was talking with Deb earlier about the Baton Rouge floods from last year, and roughly 10 to 15% of the overall economic cost was actually covered by insurance. And that's pretty significant. That means that a lot of people lost everything, and they just did not have the proper national flood insurance available to get back on their feet. And that's something that's going to continue to need to be addressed in the coming years. I thought this was kind of put a personal spin on this, just to kind of represent how the losses, what they represent in terms of the cost per person. And we can see that there's been about a 2.5% annual growth in the economic costs of weather disasters per person globally. So in 2016, $21 per person was the cost of weather disasters. So if you add up 150 people times 21, and we're talking about quite a bit of money. Okay, so business impact. I talked about this at the beginning. So we know that the global economy is more interconnected than ever before. We know that extreme weather can have a significant disruption to the global supply chain and business interests. I would say the best example of this would be in 2011 in Thailand, where there were massive floods in November and December. Now, when these floods happened, it had a literal chain effect on microprocessing chips and computer software chips all around the world, because there were certain parts that were being made in, say, Europe and the United States, and because the factories in Thailand were all swamped and damaged, none of those other facilities were able to work. So that led to a chain reaction of a lot of different companies losing money. So in a lot of instances for that event, the BI cost was more significant than the actual physical damage in some of the facilities in Thailand themselves. So it's something that you have to, especially if you're with a global company, you have to pay attention to what's going on, not just in front of you, but on the other side of the world as well, because it could end up having a fairly significant impact to your bottom line. And this graphic here just kind of shows that even further in the U.S. I highlighted in yellow some of these storms, and these statistics don't talk about events causing damage at the specific location. These are talking about businesses in terms of not having employees being able to get to work because of lightning, because of flood, because of a hurricane or earthquake. So, and that's a pretty high percentage. I mean, 72% from power outages, that's not too surprising, but just lightning, 34% of people were not able to do their jobs and cause some level of BI. So things you may not even consider do have an impact. Okay, so the insurance industry. So I will readily admit that the insurance industry, especially in the U.S., has been very late to the party in trying to acknowledge that climate change is something that they're going to have to take on as a bigger issue. The industry, the business model has historically been a retrospective one, meaning that they place rates, they price their contracts based on events that have already happened. Now, climate change is essentially forcing the industry to completely rethink how they view weather catastrophe loss, and now they're starting to take losses and trend forward in their pricing. And one of the ways that they're doing this is something called catastrophe modeling. Now, is there anyone in the room that's familiar with the term CAT modeling? No one. Great. Okay. Well, I've got a lot on it. So this is a very broad definition of what catastrophe modeling is. So essentially, it's a computer simulation that's used to identify exposure risks and talk about loss frequency and being able to calculate specific losses from different perils. So essentially, we take a portfolio from a client, and we can run certain individual scenarios through the model, and then it's able to come up with an output that shows a footprint, that shows the overall event footprint of the event, and then you can know whether or not your individual exposures are going to be affected and what the potential costs could be. Now, what's used for calibration are historical events, meaning what's already happened, or something called a stochastic event set, which is essentially a hypothetical set of scenarios that we come up with, and often hundreds of thousands, or not, if not millions of events, to run the model to come up with these different scenarios, hypotheticals, for people to get a better sense as to what their risks are based on their own individual portfolios. So this is a fancy graphic here just to kind of show how they work, because you can see that there's a lot that goes into it using a lot of different parameters. Initially, you start out with a data preparation, and then you get into the exposures, and then you're pulling the individual hazards, meaning the event. And then you end up deriving the loss calculation, and then you have to use the different parameters such as the actual portfolio and the insurance license contract language that are in the policies, and then you get the result, and then we can take that to our clients, and you have a better understanding later. So it's actually very complicated. People that are much smarter than me and much better in terms of coming up with mathematical formulas can put these all together. But they are very effective, and within the insurance industry, they are becoming much more, I would say, just used and more favorable for people looking to underwrite and price. So I'm going to wrap up, because I think I'm probably way beyond time. This was a survey that I pulled off a line from last year that I participated in. So whether or not CAT modelers and executives in the insurance industry currently consider climate change in your work. Now, surprisingly, CAT modelers, which are a lot of them are engineers and software guys, a lot of them just aren't really thinking about it. However, executives and managers are. And going forward, how they actually view the risk of climate change. And I think it's a good thing, these results, in the sense that everyone recognizes, or most people recognize, especially from the executive side, that climate change is becoming more of an issue, and you're going to have to address it and continue to come up with resiliency plans to ensure that when your business is affected, you know what to do and have a plan in place to prepare for the next one, because the odds are you're going to get not just one, there's going to be two. It's just a matter of when, not if. And just to recap, and because of time, I will just say thank you, and I will talk to you guys later. Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to, on behalf of the city, of course, first and foremost, I want to welcome you to New Orleans. I know we're about halfway through the symposium, but I hope you're been able to enjoy the beautiful city and everything we have to offer. You know, in my ride over this morning, or earlier today, about an hour or two ago, about the 30 seconds it takes to get from City Hall to the Intercontinental Hotel, I was thinking about how excellent, how fantastic it is that this symposium is scheduled right now, this week. Because you guys are smack dab in the middle of Mardi Gras. And I hope some of you were able to enjoy the festivities over the weekend. We had an NBA All-Star game in town as well. And I hope some of you will be able to stay for the next couple of days through this weekend for the second weekend of Mardi Gras, which is really the big one where the big parades take place. And Mardi Gras is a fantastic example of how dynamically vulnerable places like New Orleans or any major metropolitan area in the world truly is. Right? You take, for example, our population, about 500,000, a little bit under that, 450,000 or so. But Mardi Gras plus All-Star this year will bring in about 2 to 2.5 million people. And with 2 to 2.5 million people comes all the implications for public safety, public health, and all the supporting sectors and different types of mission areas that goes into place. And it's not just about vulnerabilities from man-made disasters or technological hazards. And I'll talk a little bit more about the chemical piece and the work we're doing in that space in a second here. But a lot about the natural hazards. And New Orleans is, of course, no stranger to the impact of natural hazards. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today is the recovery process and a very 30,000-foot broad overview into the biggest changes that have been made, the largest changes since Hurricane Katrina, and the long forgotten and often forgotten Hurricane Rita that came about 2 to 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. Okay, so let's see if I can figure this thing out. There we go, perfect. So I imagine a lot of folks in this room here have either studied Hurricane Katrina or are interested or involved in the response to Hurricane Katrina. But just as an overview, I wanted to show this diagram that really to describe the geography of New Orleans, the best way to describe it is a cereal bowl. The majority of the city, well over 90%, is under sea level. And there's a common misconception that when Katrina occurred that it overtopped the river levee system and the river was what flooded the city. If that had happened, we wouldn't be standing here right now. There would have been no way to cap the Mississippi River. It was actually Lake Pontchartrain. And Lake Pontchartrain, not necessarily the actual lake levees, but the levees that lined, the flood walls that lined the different inlets and the different pumping canals, 17th Street Canal, London Avenue Canal, the Orleans Avenue Canal, those are the ones that were breached and flooded the city. But if you look at this map here, and a lot of this has to do with public health and health disparities as well, because the most vulnerable areas of the city are also the most low-lying areas. And so the Gentilly Ridge area, these are areas that historically have higher than normal socioeconomic disparities, but also the lowest lying areas, and therefore were the most flooded and the longest recovery process post-storm. So a little bit of a statistical kind of overview of the impact. About 80% of the city flooded. Really, if you look at it in that diagram there, the French Quarter area directly across the river from the French Quarter, Algiers, those are the only parts of the city that are at or above sea level. And so the majority of the city, the rest of it, was flooded during Katrina. About 135,000 housing units destroyed. Population went from about 500,000, so we're basically back up to what we were back then, to about half of that, about 230,000. And from a monetary aspect, $150 billion in impacts and $120 billion in federal spending. And that number is still going up. The city actually just concluded its one of the final settlements with FEMA regarding public assistance. So again, what I'm going to do here is provide a very broad 30,000-foot overview. Realistically, we could make this into a semester-long college-level class, but I have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, so I'm going to focus on 3 very, very broad themes. And these themes are directly correlated, are directly attached to our resilience work that is ongoing with the 100 Resilience Studies program with the Rockefeller Foundation, which unless I'm mistaken, a lot of organizations in the room here have been very intimate partners as part of that work, including AECOM. So the first is about investing in pre-disaster planning for post-disaster recovery. This was mentioned in not only the welcoming remarks for this set of presentations, but also in my previous presenter's presentation. And I think a lot of folks in this room have probably been planners before, where one of the biggest pet peeves we have as being a planner is that society is reactive, right? Something happens, funding goes up, not only on the Homeland Security side, but also the public health side. And then slowly but surely, when things start returning to normal, that funding goes away, as if preparedness, as if risk reduction is some sort of time-dependent mission set or operational area, right? So as planners, we spend our entire lives working against that and trying to answer that question, if something happens, what do we do? And so what I'm going to provide a little bit of overview here is in terms of the biggest improvements that have been made based upon the lessons learned from Katrina. And the single largest failure that happened in 2005 was, of course, the fact that you had a large population that could not evacuate itself, which was left behind here in the city. And we saw the images from the Superdome, the Convention Center, all the different areas that became, areas of last refuge. And so as a direct result of that, as a direct lessons learned, the city developed what's now called the CAE, City Assisted Evacuation. This was developed in 2006, 2007, and is essentially the system by which the city, the state, and our federal partners assist about 35,000 to 40,000 residents and tourists who do not have the means of self-evacuation to evacuate the city. And a lot of times this is not an issue of a socioeconomic concern. It could be it's a family of 10 with one vehicle. How do you fit 10 people in one vehicle? Unless it's a clown car, you can't, right? And so that system exists to provide for that element. The system currently consists of about 17 general population pickup points. As you ride around the city, you may have seen the EvacuSpot statues. It's a 10-foot tall statue of a man raising his hand, otherwise known as somebody trying to catch beads from the Mardi Gras floats going by, plus 2 tourist evacuation spots and a centralized processing center. So in reality, 20 locations located throughout the city, developed and identified through a geographic analysis over the years of both transit ridership data, but also just general census data that are geographically located to be the collection point for individuals who cannot evacuate on their own. From there, they would be taken to our centralized processing center and board a coach bus and/or aircraft and evacuate out of the hurricane risk area. So this plan, again, was developed post-Katrina, but a lot of times, you develop plans and you never get a chance to use them. And luckily that's the case, because we don't want to have a situation like that again. But one thing that happened with the CAE was at Hurricane Gustav in 2008. So this plan was put into place in 2008, and New Orleans is, to this day, still the only city to have fully evacuated its population utilizing a foundational framework such as city-assisted evacuation. The second pet peeve that a planner has is, of course, developing a plan which then just sits on a bookshelf somewhere, or nobody looks at it, right? Or it's only good for maybe lighting the fire when the temperature gets cold outside. Well, I would argue that the most important, I think a lot of you would agree with me, the most important component of planning is the validation of those plans, right? And how do you validate a plan? It's through training and exercises. And so we include a very robust training and exercise schedule on this, being cognizant that it's been almost 12 years now since Katrina, a number of years since Hurricane Gustav in 2008, and about 5 years or so since the last hurricane, which is Hurricane Isaac in 2012. A long, long time. A lot of complacency can set in, both on the city side, on the governmental side, but also on the community, the whole community side as well. And so this year we'll be, in partnership with the Department of Transportation at the federal level, we'll be conducting a full-scale exercise of the City-Assisted Evacuation Plan, about $750,000 million exercise later on in May, which if you're located here in the local area, please get with me afterwards. We can include you as an observer in that. And then when it comes to emergency management, I like to think of it as a 3-legged stool, right? Communication, collaboration, and coordination. And during a disaster, if one of those legs gets knocked out, that stool is not going to stay up. So one of the single largest failures during Hurricane Katrina was, of course, communication. People could not talk to one another. The public safety communications network went down. The cellular network went down. Other means of communication, even ham radio, were significantly impaired. And so one of the largest investments that have been made with assistance from the federal level and international agencies has been the development of what is now known as one of the top 3 most robust public safety radio communication systems in the country, and that is LWIN, the Louisiana Wireless Information Network. And this network is to the point now where, after 12 years of building it, where there's 99.9% portable-to-portable radio coverage anywhere in the state. So I can take my radio here and talk to somebody in the northernmost tip of Louisiana just through my radio. And there's 97% coverage inside of a building, such as the Intercontinental here or any of the larger buildings we have. A very, very robust system that will be built upon by the FirstNet project that's being rolled out by the federal government, not to be confused with Skynet, right? And then finally, from a business standpoint, we've done a lot of research and kind of analytics into our business community. New Orleans is a very small business economy, dominated economy in general. And I brought up AECOM earlier because AECOM was a strong partner in our recent small business survey, in which some of the results showed us that the majority of small businesses that exist here were not here during Hurricane Katrina. In fact, A large portion of those weren't even here during Hurricane Isaac, which was the last major hurricane we had in 2012. So from a risk communication standpoint, from a public preparedness standpoint, to build that culture of preparedness, that shows us that a lot more work is needing to be done, because if somebody moves here from, let's say, New York or Minnesota, well, you're not going to know about hurricanes. Maybe New York's a bad example with Sandy, but Minnesota's a good example, right? And so a large portion of that program has been focused on how do we facilitate and assist businesses as part of the whole community in being a good partner, not only to government, but also to the community as a whole. And one of the largest complaints that came after Katrina was, well, this storm happened, there's checkpoints set up, I have no way to get my trucks in. I have no way to recuperate my business economy. So one of the largest things that's been created is this very large re-entry placard program in which we operate 4 different tiers for different types of businesses. So the largest businesses would be a tier 1. Those are the folks that get to return first, then tier 2, then tier 3, and tier 4 is our general population. The whole goal of that re-entry placard program is that by the time our community comes back, by the time those 35 to 40,000 people using city-assisted evacuation, plus the hundreds of thousands of people, really the millions if you look at the region, that are not utilizing city-assisted evacuation, by the time they return, essential businesses and the community is back to at least some level of baseline operating status. The second theme is really about integrating resilience-driven whole community decision-making. And in Homeland Security, the term whole community has been very widely used over the last couple of years. A lot of it was due to the previous FEMA administrator, Craig Fugate. This was his major push. But it's about including everyone, not just government, not just your nonprofit agencies, not just your private organizations, but everyone that forms part of the community into your preparedness and resilience planning operation. And I think this group especially would appreciate that first bullet point about utilizing good science in everything we do. Anecdotal evidence is very important. Stories are great, but nothing beats good old-fashioned qualitative and quantitative science. And I'll bring up an example, kind of veer off topic, off the natural hazards piece here, and talk about our chemical defense work. So for the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of work with DHS, DOD on local level, domestic level chemical defense. So if a catastrophic chemical incident occurs, whether it be something like Graniteville in 2005 with the chlorine release, or some sort of weapons of mass destruction event, how do we as a community respond to that? What are the essential elements of information that we need to have and answer right at the get-go that will then lead to a cascade of answers that will increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the response? So as part of this, we've been doing a very thorough quantitative analysis into our actual burden of risk as it relates to chemicals. For a long, long time, we thought, chlorine is probably one of the largest commodities being transported in and out of the city. Realized after the analysis, it's not. It's actually a very small amount of what's being transported back and forth, right? So based upon that, we're able to then translate that data into investments such as cyanokits, or investments such as hydrogen, fluoride, or counter technologies to that type of commodities, and to make good investments based upon good science. The second investment that's been made, and this kind of really ties back to that business piece, is the development of a business EOC. And this is something that's being researched across the country. A lot of big cities have started developing kind of a micro EOC that is for private industry, whether it be co-located in the actual emergency operations center, or maybe just a virtual cell where different businesses and their business crisis management centers are connected virtually to the city's or the state's emergency operations center. So we're in partnership now with the University of Louisiana Lafayette and a few other organizations, a multidisciplinary partnership, to apply for a couple grant opportunities that will look at development of a business EOC and then translating that model to be something that other cities can then take and implement at the local level. A great example of this is our relationship with Rouse's and Walgreens. Rouse's is one of our larger local grocery chains, and Walgreens is, of course, an national level grocery chain, where those individuals are either co-located with us in the EOC or in constant communication through our virtual command and control systems anytime an incident occurs, whether it be a hurricane or just 2 weeks ago when we had the tornado go through New Orleans East. And then finally, the NOLA Ready Preparedness Program. And this is about risk communication, right? And a good example of this is flood insurance. This was alluded to by the previous presenter, that here in New Orleans, the new flood maps show that a large portion of the city maybe either don't need flood insurance because of the risk reduction system or the new levy system, or have a very low need for flood insurance. But that sometimes translates, compounded by the complacency of not having a storm in a while, translates to, well, I don't need anything, right? So how do we combat that from a risk communication standpoint, from a science standpoint, to show that it's not about not needing anything, it's about that you are now paying less for the same amount of protection, right? So that's been an ongoing mission area for us at the city as well, in collaboration with our partners. And then finally, the last thematic area is promoting sustainability, because and for those of you who work in defense and homeland security, we have this very bad habit of taking all this money and buying toys and gadgets and people walking around looking like Inspector Gadget. Well, then the funding goes away and there's no way to maintain any of that, right? So looking at it from a sustainable standpoint, what good, smart, science-driven, data-driven investments can we make now that'll continue should the funding go away, or should some of the support go away due to a variety of different issues. And those vulnerabilities go, I talked about hurricanes, I talked about chemical events, but the new changing landscape, the changing climate of vulnerabilities extends into things like climate change. Right? I read almost every day an article about how in New Orleans the levee system will become a seawall, and how we're in the new Atlantis in a couple of years and all this type of stuff. That is a real concern. Right? How do we adopt that into our resilience planning? How do we adopt that into our crisis management and consequence management planning? On the flip side, preparing for threats of the future, even from a terrorist standpoint, such as CCTA, which is complex coordinated terrorist attacks. We still plan for large-scale things, such as the nuclear bomb going off, or a large-scale catastrophic chemical incident. But more so now, the threat is something like a truck driving down Bourbon Street, such as Nice, France, right? An active shooter incident occurring at the same time in a convention center, such as Orlando. And at the same time, maybe the airport being hit with a micro active shooter scenario, such as happened out in California. So how do we prepare for this? As you walk around the city today, you'll see dump trucks blocking the foot of canal at Bourbon Street. You'll see hydraulic wedge barriers blocking streets. This is the climate we're in now. This is what we have to prepare for. So how do we take those preparations and combine that with the overall Homeland Security enterprise, which includes natural disasters, other technological hazards? How do we do all that based upon good data, good science? That's really where we're headed now in terms of the field itself. All right, so that's actually all I had. I know we have some questions at the end, but I appreciate your time. I'll be back.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking with us for the webinar, and hope you enjoyed that encore presentation of the Best of the Symposium, Emergency Preparedness. And if you're interested in more of these types of insightful presentations and on getting to hear more and discuss more about the future of EHS, the future of environment, health, and safety, then please plan on attending our next Campbell Institute Symposium. That would be the 2018 Symposium. It's going to be held February 20th through the 21st in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can see the prices there for registrations for our general attendees and then for Campbell Institute members. To register, you go to the website that's listed there, www.thecampbellinstitute.org/symposium, and reserve your spot today. We look forward to seeing you in February. And everyone, just have a safe day and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you.